coming tonight. How's the volume? All right, as she said, I'm from Ogden, Utah, a farming community you might have heard of. And I'm from a family of 11 children. We were raised on a diet of the founding fathers, of the sacred and inspired documents that make up this fragile and beautiful gift we call democracy. And I was also raised on the idea that, as my friend Hosea in the good book says, if you sow wind, you reap the whirlwind. And 1 year ago today, our nation reaped a very, very sad and very dangerous whirlwind, sowed by wind of misinformation, and of sound bites, and of lies, and of sore losership, and of people who care more about consolidating their power than they do about protecting and defending our democracy. And we are here today because we will not stand for that whirlwind. I sat, like many of you, in disbelief that day in front of the television, and I watched the unfolding of the events in Washington, D.C. And I had so many thoughts going through my head. I started furiously scribbling them down on paper. Some of them made it into the Tribune in the following days, and some of them made it into what would then become the pillars of my congressional campaign. And I want to talk about some of those in a minute. But first of all, I want to talk about the person I'm running against in District 4. You may have heard of him, Mr. Burgess Owens. Now, I think Burgess Owens, well, he happens to belong to the same political party as I do. But more than that, he's made a fortune talking about one thing: whiners, weenies, and wimps. Have you heard this saying from Burgess Owens? He talks about people who disagree with him as being called whiners, weenies, and wimps. Well, a couple of weeks ago, he made a speech as well about what defines real men. And I've thought a lot about what defines a real man versus a whiny, a weenie, or a wimp. And let me tell you, I have a very different definition than my friend Burgess Owens. I believe that a real man prioritizes peace over violence. It is cheap to engage in violence. It is cheap to think that the only way to effect change in this democracy is to take weapons to the heart of our nation's capital and to force your ideas and your untruths on others. It takes a real man to understand that in this country we effect change through peaceful means. A real man understands that truth matters. A whiner, a weenie, or a wimp will say at the expense of truth anything that it takes to hold on to his own power, or to mislead the public, to stir up dust, to provoke the whirlwind. But truth matters yesterday, today, it will always matter, and truth, by the way, will always prevail. A real man will never prioritize political expediency over leadership and over the right thing to do. And I think that in the last year, since January 6, 2021, we've seen a lot of whiners, weenies, and wimps who care more about their own political careers than they do about leading out in this country that so desperately needs leadership in this moment of crisis. And this is one reason I'm running for Congress in District 4. We need more leaders. We need more truth sayers. We need more peaceful effectors of change. And I commit to do all of those things.
Can we get you in 3 too?
I want to now talk about those 3 pillars of my candidacy that started forming the day I sat in front of the television on January 6th as I watched the glass break in our nation's capital, as I watched members of Congress and members of the Senate fleeing out of those sacred halls, and as I watched people desecrate the most sacred and fundamental process in our democracy, the peaceful transfer of power. The first one is that I believe every good American prioritizes principle over personality. We know that the principles of our founding matter more than anything else. These principles that all men are created equal. The principle that every single person has a voice in the outcomes of our country, and that is at the ballot box, and every vote matters.
Every vote.
The principle that together we accomplish much more than when we're isolated, and that together we have so much more in common than that divides us, and that our differences are what make the strengths of this country unique, and not what pulls us apart. The second pillar of my campaign is that I want to prioritize solutions over sound bites. And we'll talk a lot about solutions, and maybe you and I will disagree on what some of those legislative solutions are to the problems that our country faces. But the beauty is that the focus is on the solutions and not on the sensationalism and not on the extremism and not on the untruths or the misinformation that so often permeate our media and our politicians' rhetoric. It must stop, and I promise it will stop right here. The very last thing I want to mention today, and something that I think sets us apart here tonight, is that I know that optimism will always triumph over outrage. And that is the third pillar of my candidacy. Tonight, yes, we are upset and we are angered by the things that we witnessed a year ago today at our nation's capital. It should and must never happen again. And it is up to you and I to make sure, and it is up to people in these halls to make sure that it never happens again. But I also want to say that gatherings like this fill me with a sense of optimism that none of that outrage could ever trump. No pun intended. Optimism is what guided our founding fathers to write those inspired documents. It's what guided Abraham Lincoln to lead our nation through an unprecedented crisis, a split that seemed almost unsolvable. And it is optimism that will lead all of us to the best version of this country's future. I know it, you know it, that is why we are here today. We ask our politicians to recognize all of these things when they go back to those sacred halls to solve the problems that we're here tonight to discuss. And I want to say that, as Abraham Lincoln said in that very dire moment during the Civil War, it is up to us, it is up to you and I. Now, we just heard from Evan McMullen. He comes from the CIA. He's got a heck of a background. I'm one of you. I come from the farm fields where we reap what we sowed, and most of the time that was corn, okay? But I decided that sitting on the sidelines in a moment of crisis was not something that I was going to do, much like you decided in order to be here today. And as Abraham Lincoln said, in the heart of that Civil War crisis, it is up to us, the living, to be dedicated here to the great task remaining before us, that we here highly resolve that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish. And you and I know that it won't. We ask our senators and our elected officials to help us ensure that it doesn't. Thank you for coming. God bless America. God bless all of you.